Please welcome the director of the Turkana Basin Institute and the National Geographic explorer, Isaiah Nengo.
Hello, Jumbo. Oh, you guys know the word. That's great. All right. As you can tell, I'm from Kenya, and like Lee Bagger, I'm also interested in finding out about where we came from. But I'm interested in not only where we came from, but in a broader context. You know, where did the environment that allows us to be here come from? So I have to go deeper. I have to dig deeper in time to answer this kind of question. So what I want to do is I want to take you on a safari, all right? I want to take you on a special safari. It's a time safari. We're going to go back in time. I brought my time capsule. We're going to move fast. So come on in and let's go. All right, so we're going to push back past Homo naledi. We're going to push back past Homo erectus. We're going to push back past the invention of tools. We're going to go all the way back to a place called Turkana. And there's a site called Napudet. The site is about 13 million years old. It preserves an ancient forest where there was a huge volcanic eruption that just blanketed the whole surface and buried trees. Now, at this place, we find tree trunks that are still standing, or what's left of the trees still standing upright. It buried elephants, it buried rhinos, it buried a variety of animals in this landscape. Now, so this is a difficult place to work in. Average daily temperature across the globe, this is the most hottest place in the world. And what you're looking for are these tiny little things. I mean, it's a fool's errand, but we persist. All right, so in 2014, September 2014, I remember it like it was yesterday, I was working with a small team of local Kenyans. We've been out there the whole day. Actually, we've been there for 3 weeks. We'd found nothing. And we've been excavating, we've been sieving at one particular location. We found zero. End of the day, we're going back to our cruiser. And one of my field assistants, John Ekusi, the guy in the middle, pointing at something, starts cycling around in front of us. Actually, he said we wanted to smoke a cigarette. We chased him away. And he started cycling around. And he says, we asked him, man, did you find something? And he said, yeah, I think I found something. We say, what do you think you found? He said, I think I have a knee of an elephant. We were excited, a knee of an elephant. I mean, 3 weeks we hadn't seen a fossil. A whole knee of an elephant, fantastic. So we go out there, we take out a brush, we brush the top of it, and we say, lo and behold, John, this is not the knee of an elephant. What you have here, what we have here, is a skull of an ape. We can just see the top of it because the brow ridges are facing at the front. We know it's a primate. Most of it is buried. It is 5 p.m. We can't do anything about it. We have to go back and come back the next day. Nobody slept. We were back up at 5, and 3 hours, 4 hours of excavation, we took out the skull. And then we took it out to the synchrotron in Grenoble. We got it scanned with this powerful X-ray that allows you to peer through however tough it is. And what we find is an amazing specimen, inside and out. It is the most complete skull of an ape ever found. And it's just exquisite. Everything is preserved. And you can see in the inside as well, and what you'll see is that all the unerupted teeth are intact. The hearing apparatus, the cochlea and semicircular canal are intact. Those are those green things. And not only that, using the scanning technology, we can slice through the teeth, blow them up, and we're able to see the growth rings on the teeth, on the enamel. When we grow, we add this daily growth ring, and we can estimate the age of this individual. And we know that this baby, this tiny baby of an ape, was about 1 year and 3 months old when it died. This is the first time this had ever been done. All right, it's the marriage of ancient techniques in paleontology and cutting-edge technology. So there you see the slice through the teeth. So it's an amazing fossil. a baby that we know belongs to a species or belongs to a group. We call the Nyanzapeticins, that we know is at the very base of our family, the one that unites us and all the apes, the gorillas, the chimpanzees, and the orangutans. So this is a time before the ancestors of the apes that you see in Asia spread out. They were all still out there in Africa. Right, so back into a capsule. We want to go back, farther back in time from 13 million years. We're going to push back to about 17 million years ago. And what do we find? There's a site that I work at on the other side of Lake Turkana, about 17 million years old. And we've been excavating there for 3 years. And what we've discovered is this amazing array of fossils. There are 5 different species of elephants represented in what we found in this little place so far. And there are 5 different ape species also represented in this place that we found so far. So you push back into Africa today. I mean, in Africa today, you have 2 elephant species. You push back 20 million years ago, we had 5 in one place. And I'm pretty sure that if we did a sampling through the entire Africa at that time, we probably had about at least a dozen species of elephants wandering throughout Africa. So imagine, I mean, a safari where you encounter 12 different species, 5 different species of elephants, 5 different species of apes, big ones, small ones, all living in the same place at the same time. That was what Africa was like. So what we want to know is what happened. How did we go from this heavily forested, tons of elephants, rhinos, and primates, apes, to the Africa that we have today, with 1 elephant species or 2 elephant species left, grasslands? You know, what happened? And the clue comes from a whale. 17 million years ago at another site, we get back into a capsule, we discovered back in the 60s, the skull of a small whale. And it belongs to the group that are generally called the beaked whales. And the problem is this. In Turkana now, where the whale was found, is almost 800 kilometers from the coastline. And 800 kilometers above sea level, about 1 kilometer above sea level. What the hell is a whale doing up there? We call it a whale of a problem. And to solve this problem, because we think it is the key to us understanding how Africa went from what we know existed in the past to the Africa that made it possible for us to evolve, this whale holds the key. So I put together a large team of scientists that include technophysicists. They have people who reconstruct climates. We have paleontologists. We have in total about 28 people involved in this project to crack this problem. And what we think is that at the time when the whale ended up where it ended up, this area was not that high, and it wasn't so far away from the coastline. And the Rift Valley, the Great Rift Valley, where the Turkana Basin now lies, where this baby ape was found, where this whale was found, the Turkana Basin then, we think, was no more than maybe 20 kilometers away from the ocean. And what has happened is that as the Rift Valley spreads, and because it's a triple junction with 3 plates, some sliding past each other, as they slide past each other and you have the spread, the mantle heats up and it pushes up the whole place. So the whale it could not have been more than 200 meters when that whale ended up there. But since then, that whole area has been pushed up almost 600 meters. So I have a model here that you will see. You pay attention to that green-blue, and if it plays correctly, you will see that the blue is much further inland, and we're at 27 million years, and you'll see it spreading out. Right. And so our thinking is that this uplift broke up the land, providing lots of different habitats. It changed the air currents. It caused the climate to change. Things got drier. The forests disappeared. As this forest disappeared, we also had migration of mammals from Eurasia into Africa. This drying up and the opening up of the savannas is what made it possible for us to evolve. So when we go back in time, what we learn from our time travel is that we've been through some improbable times. We've been through these massive changes in climate, massive changes in how the geology and the surface of the land looked like in Africa. We've survived all of this, and so I am confident that with the modern technology that we have and with the unity of purpose, we can solve the problems that we have and make it through another 1 million years. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaiah. So our last two speakers have highlighted how stories from our past can inform our present. Our next panel will take a look at the critical conservation stories playing out right now around the world and highlight both the power and responsibility of telling these stories. Rachael Bale is a senior editor at National Geographic, where she co-leads the Animal Desk. She also manages and contributes to Wildlife Watch, a project that we'll learn from more about in the next panel. Welcome, Rachael.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about Wildlife Watch. Wildlife Watch is an investigative reporting project supported by National Geographic Society and National Geographic Partners that seeks to shine a light on commercial-scale wildlife crime and exploitation. The illegal wildlife trade is valued somewhere between $7 and $20 billion a year. And it is not just a major driver of species decline, but it leads to corruption, it contributes to the exploitation of indigenous communities, to the erosion of civil society, to say nothing of the suffering of the individual animals involved. With Wildlife Watch, our goal is always to have an impact. We aim to do stories that make a difference. And our stories have, our Wildlife Watch reporting team has had some positive impacts. With pangolins, for example, just last week I heard from a mother asking me for a recommendation of a pangolin rescue organization because her kids wanted to donate their allowance. Our wildlife tourism reporting helped lead to Instagram developing a pop-up message whenever a user searches for a hashtag that's potentially associated with a problematic wildlife practice. Wildlife Watch reporting has led to high-level government discussions about how better to protect jaguars from poaching in Suriname, and has led to law enforcement raids on restaurants in Vietnam serving critically endangered giant freshwater fish. And one of my favorites, after Canadian authorities stopped the smuggling of leeches from Russia, there were 12,000 of them, and every single one of those leeches found new homes after our story ran. The June issue of National Geographic is one we're especially proud of. It features a package of 3 Wildlife Watch stories: the hidden cost of wildlife tourism, the world's most trafficked mammal, the pangolin, and a group of incredible women in Zimbabwe who put their lives on the line every day to protect wildlife from poachers. So let me tell you a little bit about this story first. This story is about the global captive wildlife tourism industry. Social media has totally changed the game here. All of a sudden, there is this massive demand for up-close, hands-on interaction with wildlife that didn't exist before. The journalists who worked on this story went to 6 countries in 4 continents, starting in the Amazon, and then heading to other tourist hotspots, including Thailand, Russia, and the United States. And what they found was, behind these once-in-a-lifetime experiences was serious animal suffering. This story is about the world's only known mammal with true scales, the pangolin. Pangolins are trafficked by the ton for their scales, in demand for traditional Chinese medicine and also for their meat, which is considered a luxury food. And even though they are believed to be the world's most trafficked mammal, most people in the West, outside of the conservation community, have never even heard of a pangolin, yet they're on the verge of extinction. Photographer Brent Stirton and I worked on this story for almost 2 years. We went to Zimbabwe, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Uganda, Vietnam, and China, tracing the illegal trade in pangolins from poaching to final consumer. And what we found was that there's some really dedicated people working to rescue and rehabilitate pangolins and to stop the illegal trade. But there are also major loopholes that are allowing the illegal trade to continue. Now I would like to introduce you to our panel. We have Brent Stirton, photographer and National Geographic Fellow, Natasha Daly, a writer and editor at National Geographic, and Kirsten Luce, photojournalist. Please welcome the panel. So what I'd like to start with is all of these stories had really upsetting parts to report. They're tough stories. And one thing I've often struggled with in telling these stories is you want to show the readers what exactly is happening because you need to get them to care. But at the same time, sometimes if something is too intense, too gory, too sad, you might, get people putting their fingers in their ears, running away, and just wanting to pretend it's not happening. So Natasha, let me ask you first. Was this something you thought about when you were writing the wildlife tourism story? And how do you try to avoid empathy fatigue?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something I thought about. The last thing you want is when you're reporting a story that is full of difficult, experiences of suffering to turn readers off and make them not even want to read it. But I think I made a pretty deliberate decision, I think, from the beginning, after I finished reporting and just before I started to actually write the story, to not hold back. And I think the reason I did that was because this entire industry exists because people don't necessarily know what's going on behind the curtain, behind the scenes. And in order to tell this story in a way that was compelling, in a way that was effective, I felt like I really had to lay bare exactly what was going on, or else it wouldn't be doing the job.
Yeah, one thing, it's funny, for me, when I was writing pangolins, it was actually kind of the opposite. And I think maybe that's because the basic premise of the story already was that pangolins are being killed in large scale. Like, we didn't need to convince readers of that already. So, for example, like with this photo, this woman was about to slaughter that pangolin. And I mean, we were there for the entire process, but this was the photo that we ended up using in the story. What do you think? We didn't have to really show the bloody bits to get people to care.
No, I think there's enough menace in this one. But, I think trauma is an engine, yeah? I think that if you experience trauma in the coverage of your stories, you have a greater chance of putting that into your pictures or into your words. That's your job. Personally, if you're not feeling something, you shouldn't be there in the first place. That's just common sense. There's that cliche, you're a tourism in someone else's tragedy. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, I think it's very true.
You ask about empathy fatigue, and I think we, even reporting this story, we actually lived, I feel like, empathy fatigue. We were in the field for 3 months in total, reporting on the suffering within the wildlife tourism industry, and I think we encountered dealing with empathy fatigue ourselves. It was sustained exposure to animal suffering, and so it's like, at the beginning, what you see, you're shocked by, and you have to process that, but then as days go by, it starts to become a little more normalized, and that's something, I think it helped us do our job. I think it helped us get what we needed to get, but at the same time, I understand what that's like.
It's a really challenging balance to strike.
Yeah.
That's why intention is so important. If you have clarity on what your intent is for these stories right from the beginning, all of that is bearable. So not happening to you, it's not happening to your animals. You have a duty to report on it.
Right.
So everybody on stage is a storyteller, and often it can be really hard to fit everything we want to say into a story. So real quick, I want to go down the line. Was there any anecdote or fact or piece of your reporting that didn't make it into the final story that you wish people knew?
I mean, of course, there's so many, but we, again, reported the story for about 3 months, and the very first place we went was the Amazon, and we went to this village called Puerto Alegria, Peru, and there they have a viewing platform. So these Colombian tour operators would bring the relatively rich Colombians across the river by the boatload, where they could pose and take selfies with sloths, caimans, anteaters, margays. They had 7 or 8 different species of animals that they had plucked from the wild to pose with. This was, of course, concern to us, fit right into our story. We wanted to understand what happened when the tourists left. So here we followed Larissa, who's 8, back to her home. And I was chatting with her in Spanish and her brother, and I said, well, where does the sloth sleep? And her brother, without skipping a beat, said, oh, well, he sleeps up in the trees, but we feed him so he comes down in the morning. And as I'm thinking to myself, that doesn't sound so bad. And I translate to Natasha, and she's looking at me like, no, he's lying to you. And I realized immediately that I was being duped by a 10-year-old, that even this 10-year-old already had a backstory to sort of preserve my feelings as a tourist, those fuzzy feelings that I have about his animals. So that sort of set the tone. This was a couple days into the very first trip. We came across this time and time again. Every owner, handler, or trainer had this convenient backstory that kind of softened the situation for the tourist. I think the most ridiculous one we learned was Stepan, the Siberian brown bear in Russia. He lives in Moscow, and his backstory is that his mother had been shot in the woods and he had been orphaned and then raised by Svetlana and Yuri, who loved him like family and raised him like a son. Well, the real story is that these are circus trainers that bought the bear from a zoo and trained him to star in commercials and become famous. So we've received so much hate mail about misportraying Stepan because people don't realize that that's not his real story, and they want to cling to that story.
It's a lot easier to believe those stories.
Yes.
Yeah, and we found that everything is so easy to justify when your intention is pure, and that's something we encountered time and time again in reporting this story. You know, someone might say, oh, I would never watch an elephant show, but I'd ride one, or I would never ride an elephant, but I'd bathe one. And so it's that continued justification that is what we encountered over and over, because people love animals, they want to get close to them, and it's simple.
Brent, anything that you wish had made it into the story?
Okay, so guys, a lot of our work with animals leads to China, yeah? China is interesting because it's such an economic powerhouse, and so many business relations are predicated on, keeping harmonious relations with China. So I went to China, and people told me that there would be no way that I could get access to pangolins in China in restaurants, etc. What was amazing was that within 2 days and 2 taxi rides, I was in 3 different restaurants where I could find pangolins. And that just tells me everything that I want to know. We're going to have to deal with China, guys, whether it's on conservation issues or not. I think conservation is a metaphor, because whether we're talking about rare earth minerals, or we're talking about water, or we're talking about animals, we're not having the dialogue that we need to be having. I had an interesting conversation this morning with a woman from the South China Post who is doing a pangolin story. And, of 1.5 billion people, I think there's a great many empathetic Chinese that we're not talking to.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So one issue that I love to talk about is the difference between animal welfare and wildlife conservation. So wildlife tourism was a story that was squarely focused in animal welfare, and pangolins had some welfare elements, but was primarily focused on conservation. And one thing I've noticed in my own reporting is that conservationists often look at people who advocate for animal welfare and see them as bleeding hearts, missing the forest for the trees, whereas animal welfare advocates will look at conservationists and think, oh, that's so cold-hearted, how do you not care about individual suffering? And one thing, with Wildlife Watch is we think both are equally important. So what I want to ask everybody is, how can we bring both of these issues together more in our reporting?
It's tricky. And I think actually that tension is something we actually encountered in the reporting of our story. So for example, we would go to facilities And whether it was printed on their website or whether it was something they told visitors through the course of their visit, many facilities would say, you know, your money that you're paying today to get close and pet these animals is going back to conservation initiatives. And that was sometimes absolutely true. Other times we found that it wasn't. But I think that we found that visitors and tourists were very quick to sort of justify what they were doing, saying, okay, well, I'm ultimately doing good for the world because part of my ticket price is going to fund conservation. So I think that that sort of tension is something that really ran through and ultimately sort of impeded the welfare of the animals at the facilities we were visiting. And even the story itself, I think that even still, now that it's published, people often, even within the National Geographic kind of sphere, misinterpret the story as a conservation story. And it's not. It was a story that was squarely focused on the suffering of animals, whether they are imperiled in the wild or not. And by telling the story, we felt like we were able to sort of, you know, put it out there and let it be an important issue on its own. And yeah, I think they absolutely can live together. I think they can coexist, but the challenge comes down to mutual understanding and respect between the two spheres.
So I personally, I feel that these arguments that occur between those two sides are immature. I think we don't have the luxury of that time right now. What we should be doing is working together. I think rhinos are a good example of that. I can't tell you the amount of time. I'm South African, and I have sat in a room and watched guys shout at each other on a number of occasions, when in fact they have great capacity to help each other and understand each other's issues better. You know, for me, the time of being polarized in this kind of thinking is over. You know, when it comes to the legalization argument for rhino horn, for example, these are people who can work together on the legislation that's necessary to set up a legal trade, instead of which you watch arguments which lead to stalemates, which lead to no advances whatsoever. So once again, for me, it's an immature response to be having that argument in the first place.
Was there anything you wanted to add, Kirsten? Okay, so let's talk about impact for a moment. Already with pangolins, for example, some positive impact has come, such as the establishment of the Pangolin Crisis Fund. But Brent, what else do you think needs to happen in order for us to really start making a difference with pangolins?
You know, what's so amazing about the traditional medicine trade, guys, is that there are so many alternatives. Okay, for example, with pangolin scales, the number one use, 28% of the use of pangolin scales is for ease in lactation with breastfeeding women. There are over 100 alternatives, all herbal, to that situation. But we're not having that conversation. I mean, it should be such a simple thing. That's why I say again, you know, the fact that we don't have dialogue on these issues, that we are afraid to enter into dialogue. It's an interesting time with China at the moment, watching what the Trump administration is doing, the tariffs issues, et cetera, et cetera. It's the beginning of dialogue. So while a lot of this is happening in quite a negative way, I'm happy to see that at least we are confronting China on some of these issues. My hope is that it leads to a more mature dialogue. I think that, you know, once again, conservation is a metaphor here.
Yeah, and so just to be clear, while the international trade in pangolin scales has been banned, within China itself, there is a legal trade in pangolin products, and most of that is traditional Chinese medicine products. I spoke to one practitioner, though, who told me he had identified, I think, more than 100 different alternatives that could be used for the exact same purpose. So while I don't think there's, you know, people are never going to stop using traditional Chinese medicine, there's ways it can be practiced so it doesn't use endangered species.
It should be simple, right? That should just be common sense, you know?
So continuing our conversation about impact. Kirsten, one of the things you guys found was that social media is one of the major drivers of inhumane wildlife tourism. But in your storytelling, you've also used it to have a positive effect. Can you tell us a little bit about reader reaction to your story and the role social media has played?
Sure. I mean, like you said, wildlife tourism has changed dramatically with social media. There's viral advertising all the time. If an influencer or a friend of yours posts themselves with an elephant and you're going to Thailand, you think, well, I want to do that too. And you can even geotag it and go right there to the same place they did. So that kind of fueled it and sort of normalized this, became more and more ubiquitous. We've all seen these images floating around. But as the conversation sort of shifts, like we're noticing more of a sea change, and to their credit, animal welfare activists have been speaking out and denouncing these activities for a long time. But to see a message like this coming from such a huge and trusted mainstream platform like National Geographic, the conversation really does appear to be shifting. I mean, I'm seeing hundreds and hundreds of people posting on my posts on the Instagram, or tagging Natasha or I on other people's Instagrams, and starting to have conversations like, oh no, do you think our tiger was drugged? And oh no, was this us? Did we do this? And just those little things are really heartening, because you're seeing these messages start to proliferate. So, and like I said before, geotags can also be used for positive, right? You can start looking at the places you're going to go and seeing what they actually look like before you support them. It's an unfiltered platform that almost anyone can access. So in that case, it could be used for good as well.
So can you guys tell me, maybe let's go down the line, what the number one takeaway you each want people to get from your story and from your reporting?
I think, like Natasha has said, everybody sort of justifies what it is they want to do. So these baby tigers are sped bred, and their entire lives are spent something like this. When they're baby, you might be able to snuggle them, and as they grow up, they're kept in these cages. So whatever experience you have, even if it's well-meaning and you think it's relatively benign because it only lasts for a few moments, just think about that experiencing happening time and time again, over and over, as busloads of tourists pour into these places, and then think whether or not you think it's okay.
Yeah, a moment for you, but
A lifetime
endless lifetime for the animal. How about you, Natasha?
So I would say, to me, the most important thing that I kind of want people to realize is that this whole industry is driven by consumer demand. It lives and dies on what the tourist and the visitor and the citizen of the world is willing to pay for. These experiences exist because people want them to exist. And as people maybe start to evolve and start to realize what's really going on, and if they find it something that they don't agree with and they want something different, then the experiences themselves will change. So this whole industry can be changed by you and by me and by our readers. So that's really important.
That's encouraging. What about you, Brent?
I think my takeaway is that it's going away. Ultimately, if we don't start learning how to speak to each other, we've got 10 years on most things at this point. I don't have to tell you what the statistics are. I think that the world is approaching crisis on a number of levels: overpopulation, climate change, environmental crisis, etc. And my hope is that it forces us to talk to each other. Because every time we do that, we find we have far more in common than we have difference. But the rate at which this is accelerating is worrying. And I'm always very grateful to National Geographic for publishing these kinds of stories, because the truth is we have far too few publications looking at these kinds of things, and journalism is not in a strong state at this time. Yet it remains, more valuable than people have given it credit. I think we've undermarketed the true value of good truth-telling in the last 15 years, and we've learned something about that in the last 2 years. So for me, I applaud National Geographic for continuing to do this kind of work.
I think for me, I guess there are two takeaways from our pangolin story for me. First is just the very simple fact that pangolins exist. I think I've taken that for granted since we've been working on this for so long. And I've only been talking to people who know that pangolins exist, that most of the Western world has never heard of or seen a pangolin. And you have to know the animal to love it and want to save it. Sure. So I think that's incredibly important. And the other thing is just how dire the situation is. So in this photo, for example, this is a rescued pangolin. He was rescued by an organization called Save Vietnam's Wildlife, and he has been rehabilitated and he is on his way to freedom. It's a really happy photo. But at the same time, what we have to keep in mind, and we heard this story again and again, is that even though pangolins can be rehabilitated and re-released, there's a good chance they're just going to be poached again. And what one woman had told me in Cameroon, Angelia Young, who works on these issues, she said the best we can hope for is that the pangolin will breed and have babies before it's poached again and contribute just, 1 or 2 more babies to the population. And that was a really sombering message. So pangolins exist, and we love them. Okay, so we've got about 6 minutes left. I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. And just raise your hand, and there's somebody with a microphone who will come around. Let's start with you in the front.
Is that your mom?
If scientific research was done on pangolins, I've seen them in the wild, and proved that they don't help anything, is there a way that could be communicated and help them with the same applying to other creatures? They don't medically help.
No, sorry. Can you repeat that, please?
I missed the first part of what you said. Could you repeat that?
Could scientific research be done on pangolin scales and proven that they have no medical use, benefit, and have that communicated, now that we have the internet and so forth, would that help protect them?
Ma'am, that argument has been made, but what you're up against is a 5,000-year mythology in terms of traditional medicine across Asia, and that mythology is consistently marketed, and it is stronger than the facts. It's a placebo at best, but the power of the placebo in these societies is vast. And, for me, that's a leadership issue. And there are a number of Asian leaders at this point who are strong believers in traditional medicine, so we're up against it there.
We've got a hand down here.
Hi, I work in tourism, and we have to work sometimes with operators who offer these camps, and it's hard to convince them. And how do you handle the rage that you feel when you're witnessing an event like slaughtering a pangolin? And how much do you think you can convince people who've been doing this for years to change their way? And what do you think are the arguments that work?
Do you want to answer that?
Who wants to handle rage? There's definitely a lot of it.
So rage is an engine, yeah? So you get upset, and you channel that into making effective imagery or great words. Okay, because at that moment, your responsibility is much bigger than that moment. You have the opportunity, the best opportunity in print in the world to talk about that issue. So go there.
And for me, it's not so much rage, but sometimes a sense of hopelessness, especially, for example, that photo of the pangolin about to be slaughtered. We were standing there, and we just had to witness it. We couldn't do anything to help that one individual animal. And so I just had to keep reminding myself over and over again that what we're doing is we're going to bring the issue to a broader audience and hope that helps make a difference.
Yeah, for me it was guilt. I struggled with a lot of guilt witnessing these situations up close and, leaving and going back to my life, and the animals would remain there forever. Elephants live for 80 years. This is their life. They live as long as people. So it was, again, I think I coped with it in the same way that Rachael did, is that, we're there. Our job is to document this so that people even know this suffering exists. And that sort of is what kept me going.
Yeah, knowing that platform existed, that these pictures would see the light of day and they would have an impact helped dramatically. Yeah. But this one injured elephant that's gotten so much attention, Goliatham, that we showed here, he's representative of hundreds of other elephants that are in horrible situations. So the scale of the problem is much larger than even what we saw.
And I guarantee that your pictures and your words will have eased the suffering of some of the animals that you saw. That's the reality of it, isn't it? I think you were effective.
Maybe.
It's kind of as good as it gets.
I mean, there's there was a few years ago, the Tiger Kingdom, in Chiang Mai was shut down because of a lot of these reasons. And then I'd say half of the tigers disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to them. I mean, when the government isn't on the same side of helping, it's not. And also the Chinese tourists, we didn't even get into that. The Chinese tourists are now coming over in droves, higher than they ever have before. And when Western tourists are choosing more ethical experiences, they're filling the seats at the worst places.
Sure.
The saving grace of this for us is that this whole industry is driven by consumers. So it doesn't matter what the laws are. All of this stuff is legal that we documented. But if people want something different, the experiences change on a dime like that. And we were witnessing that start to happen. So there's hope.
We have time for one more quick question. Hand in the back, middle.
Thank you so much for sharing these stories. I was just wondering, you mentioned that a lot of the caretakers were kind of giving you some excuses or fake stories. Mm-hmm. So how did you manage to gain their trust and take some of the pictures of the behind the scenes?
Most of the stuff is very much visible to tourists. I mean, you can't hide an elephant, you know? And, you know, they interact with the tourists and they'll go back to where they stay. So, I mean, you'd be surprised. All of these things I was able to find by just spending a lot of time and poking around. You know, a few things we had to get special permission for in Russia, especially. But I mean, these things are quite visible. We learned to ask questions of everybody and not trust anyone. So the same way you'd report an investigative piece, you know, you just have to ask 4 or 5 people, you start getting different answers and you get closer and closer to the truth.
Yeah. So there are copies of the June issue outside if you haven't seen it. Feel free to take a look. And thank you for coming to our panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Kirsten. So that was amazing. I mean, social media can sometimes also be evil, but this is so important because sometimes you need a needle to take out a thorn. And if those selfies with animals become such a problem and such a rage, well, you have the power with your phone, with your social media presence, to be able to take that thorn out. So that is the power of storytelling, right? So that is part of National Geographic's legacy. And so is empowering the next generation of planetary stewards. Next up, I am very pleased to introduce 2 individuals who are at the helm of National Geographic's science and education agendas. Please join me in welcoming Executive Vice President and Chief Education Officer, Vicki Phillips, and Executive Vice President and Chief Scientist, Jonathan Bailey.
Thank you, Sandesh. You know, at National Geographic, a key part of our work is engaging and elevating young people so we can prepare them to follow in the footsteps of those extraordinary explorers you heard today. And Jonathan and I are very excited to have a conversation on this stage and to introduce you to some amazing young people in a little bit. You know, we want young people to love learning, to seek knowledge, to be informed decision makers so they can create lasting solutions to the global challenges we face. And like our explorers, other educators, scientists, and storytellers who often travel far and wide in the name of their craft, we know that inspiring curiosity and wonder happens both inside and outside the classroom. So Jonathan, I know that growing up in Canada, nature was a big influence on your life. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about a moment when your interest in the natural world got sparked.
Yeah, growing up in Canada, we'd go up north and we would spend weeks at a time canoeing, and you wouldn't see another person. And just the vastness of the landscape creates a sense of awe, a sense of respect for the natural world. So it was always in my bones. And then, of course, I had a mother who was writing natural history books. And I had a father who was an avid bird watcher, so that was really encouraging me. But when I think about that one moment, I would say it was when I met Jane Goodall. I was about 12, and the National Geographic magazine came under the door, and I picked it up, and I looked through it, and I saw that you could study chimpanzees. And I was a terrible reader, but I read that, you know, from cover to cover to cover. I walked around with it, and the neighbors thought this was a bit, you know, strange behavior. So when they heard that Diane Fossey and Jane Goodall and Barut Gildekas were coming to town, they bought tickets for my mom and I to go and see them. So we went, and I was so excited, and I sat there. And I looked out, and I was on the edge of my seat, and I was just absorbing every second. My mind was just flying all over the place, just thinking about the possibility. And then there was a standing ovation at the end, of course, with those 3 individuals. My mom looked down, and I was gone. I was missing. And it was New York, and she was a bit nervous. And then she looked up, and way down, up on the stage, there was this 12-year-old climbing up onto the stage. And there I was. I went up and I gave her my $2 allowance. And that was my first real contribution to conservation. But,
pretty good contribution.
Yeah. But that was the moment I just realized, then I went on to study gorillas in Gabon and as a career in science. But that was such an influential moment. What about you, Vicki?
Well, we grew up very differently. I grew up on a small farm in rural Kentucky where we raised everything we ate and had an outhouse in the back. But I grew up with this deep-seated sense of community and what it's like to live in a rural area where you fend for yourself and you take care of your neighbor. And whenever I had a free moment as a child, I would read. I mean, books took me everywhere, and I experienced things like the wildebeest migration of the Serengeti or the building of the Great Wall of China, and I went on those, world-changing sea voyages with explorer James Cook, and I learned about all those faraway places and other people's experiences through the books I read. But I often wonder what would happen if my imagination had been fueled differently, if I could have seen those things, and what would happen if we at National Geographic were able to help those things leap off the page for young people.
And I think that's really what we do. We have our amazing explorers. And just a few weeks ago, I was watching Dominique, one of our fellows, and she's in Gorongosa in Mozambique, and she was speaking to classrooms around the world. And she was talking about what it was like to be an elephant biologist and the importance of protected areas. And I watched the students listening, and I was wondering, how many of those students are going to end up being scientists? How many might go on to be study elephants? But that's one of hundreds of explorers, and each one is like a novel that has a story that we're really committed to getting into every classroom and opening the minds of children all around. So I'm just looking so forward to working with you to make that happen, to bring the science, the exploration, merged with the education, to open the minds of children all over the world.
Yeah, and being able to bring that integration of science and exploration and education, together. Those disciplines are so powerful, and I, for one, am so grateful to be joining forces with Jonathan and the SciEx team here to be able to do that, because learning about the world and how it works starts with that spirit of exploration. Can't expect young people to generate solutions without thinking like an explorer, and that's really the basis for our learning framework here, right? A framework that really focuses on curiosity and creativity and problem solving and critical thinking. So would you describe a little bit more, Jonathan, about your experience about how we do that here?
Well, I think the first thing is that that inspiration, the making it known to the next generation that these things are possible. But for me, the really important and essential next step is the doing. And I see classrooms that you're working with sign up for Geo Challenge, for example. And in a Geo Challenge, you'll make a commitment to dealing with a challenge like plastics. And you watch this classroom come together and identify solutions and then start applying it in their community and starting with their parents, but then going out to local government and local business. And then they taste success. They see that they can actually have an impact. And to me, that's when I get really inspired, because I see that these are going to be planetary stewards for the rest of their lives.
They are. And learning becomes so much more relevant for young people when they are connected with real world experts. Seeing themselves in somebody else helps them cultivate curiosity and helps put them on a critical path that they might not even considered before. And, lifting up these young people lifts up all of us. And we see this happen over and over again at National Geographic. One teacher told us, my students used to want to be rock stars, now they want to be scientists.
Yeah.
And that's just one of the numerous examples of what happens when National Geographic's mission comes to life. One bold individual with transformative ideas passing the torch to inspire tomorrow's explorers.
And I completely agree. We have to make being a scientist or a planetary steward much cooler than being a rock star. But imagine if you could be both. It'd be pretty good. But with the next generation, I see a sea change, really. I see these young leaders emerging all over the world, and this is the generation that our inaction has really put them in a difficult situation. And I don't get the sense that they're going to leave the next generation in that same position. These are the ones that are going to be securing our biosphere. So when I think about the history books of the future, I think they'll be looking back at these individuals rather than our rock stars.
I think they will be too. And you know, it's in that spirit that we're thrilled to have with us today 3 inspiring young people who are driving change in their communities across the globe. And we're so glad you stayed around with us for this segment. And Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me on the stage for a moment, because I think it's so important for people to see the way that we are arm in arm joining forces, both around National Geographic's work with explorers, but also with this next generation.
Thank you, Vicki.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You bet. So, you know, a big focus of our evolving education strategy is finding this network of young people and connecting them up, harnessing their knowledge and making sure that we can help them gain collective impact. And I know you will join me in welcoming these champions of change to the stage.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sahar Mohammadzadeh. On behalf of students, mobilizers, and activists across the globe, allow me to express my deepest gratitude for the opportunity to share the power of young people to enact change. Now, 3 years ago, my presence on this stage would have been most unanticipated. And the same holds true for 3 decades ago. My parents both came here to the United States as foreign students, seeking opportunities here much larger than those promised to them back home. Now, they had the audacity to dream that through hard work and perseverance, the education provided to them here in the United States would overcome any obstacle and open any door. Education, their great equalizer, was the formidable force that drove their intergenerational hopes and dreams. They came home from their first parent-teacher conference, however, in a cold sweat. My preschool teacher had actually convinced them that I was mute. I was mumbling meaningless rhymes and severely lagging in my social development. And this observation lacked any correlation with the girl that my parents knew so well. By the age of 1, I was already talking their mother tongue of Farsi. By 2, I was speaking Spanish with my neighbors. By 3, I was starting to read the books my mother had grown up with during the Iranian Revolution. By 4, I was mute. This observation had to be seen in person. But the next day, my incoherent chatter was not dismissed. My parents recognized them as words, a mixture of Spanish and Farsi, but they were words nonetheless. My method of communication had been diagnosed as a disability. Now, this was the first time I began to realize a harsh disconnect between my real education and the education that others thought I was receiving. The first time I really registered what it meant to be young in America. I was curious, hopeful, but ultimately rather powerless. These initial years as a young Middle Eastern girl growing up in Kentucky, I had come to believe that these systematic issues were rather static, and I felt kind of hopeless to do anything about it. But it wasn't until I entered high school, nearly a decade later, that I started to have sort of like an awakening. I came to realize that just like me, many of my peers had this overwhelming sense of powerlessness, especially in the education system. For far too long, we were being dismissed by decision makers that cited our age and lack of experiences as hindrances to civic engagement. And for far too long, our real personal experiences were being cited as uncredible by policymakers simply because we were too young to vote. It was this sentiment that ultimately sparked 12 Kentucky students to meet at a coffee shop to discuss the role of education in our lives. Now, we had this radical idea that what we were experiencing wasn't just helplessness, but helplessness that was learned. and could therefore be overcome. We didn't know this then, but this conversation marked the beginning of the Pritchard Committee Student Voice Team. And since then, our small band of teens has grown to hundreds, representing the geographic, socioeconomic, and ethnic diversity of the state, coming together in unity to solve the world's most pressing problems, especially when it comes to our public education. We discovered very quickly, however, that our conversations were not representative of Kentucky's entire student population. So we decided to hit the road, talking to as many students as we could, as often as we could, about their experiences in school and their plans after graduation. One of our very first conferences led us to Letcher County, one of the many rural areas in Kentucky where we met a student named Robbie whose story we still can't shake. With little prompting, Robbie told us that he didn't know where his next meal was coming from. That his main reason for going to school was to find empty bottles which he would later sell to the local recycling center to be able to feed his younger siblings back home. Now, although Robbie managed to graduate high school unlike most of his family members, and despite having a genuine passion for learning, he said he'd never go to college. He couldn't bear to leave his mother alone to take care of his family. Now, what does schooling mean to students like Robbie? To students like Charlotte, who recently lost her sister to the opioid crisis with no school counselors available for guidance. For students like Susie, whose low grades do not depict the fact that she works 2 part-time jobs only to come home to serve as the missing mother for her 11 younger siblings. To students like Brian, who when he applied for college was told by his family members to not go past his raising and now feels trapped in a college culture of stagnation. To students like Brianna, whose grit to pay the bills that her family have ignored for years manifests in her daily attendance at her night shift, but not in her low standardized test scores. It's important to note how open these students were to share their stories with us. Just minutes after a peer-facilitated conversation, they were letting open their heaviest of burdens and lifetime struggles. And it's important to note that student after student emphasized to us that this was the first time they thought their perspectives even mattered. Now, since then, and since Robbie's original conversations, we've gone into every conversation with no preset agenda. We came ready to have the students tell us what the problems were, and we were truly building the plane as we were flying it. And we were building fast. With just in a couple of years, we were grappling at every single resource that we could muster to take the dehumanized education system and connect the voices of students to policymakers. We published national and statewide reports that brought together business leaders, students, educators, and policymakers. We were able to create PSAs that were able to highlight the difficulties of paying for post-secondary institutions. These PSAs were then broadcasted on every single local public television and radio outlet in the state. We hosted rallies and wrote and lobbied and testified for our own bill to add a student to the superintendent's screening committee when our bylaws previously prohibited to do so. And we even hosted statewide rallies in order to come together to write our book, Ready or Not. Now, this is our attempt to shine a light on stories that hide behind the statistics, much like you do as National Geographic explorers. Within its pages, we truly wish to marry the head with the heart when it comes to policymaking. But in the end, all of this work was our way of conveying to adults that we are more than capable of igniting our own movements. That students are not just the future, but we are very much part of the present, and we are sick and tired of waiting for permission to change our world for the better. Now, this understanding is one I've kept close to my heart as I've made my own transition from high school to college this past year. Now, I know that college is supposed to be a time for self-exploration, but I keep coming back to education, whether that be through taking my courses and classes, traveling around the world with Harvard Model Congress to increase civic engagement among middle and high school students across the globe, studying international women's issues and lack of education with UN ambassadors, or even serving on the Bill and Melinda Gates' Foundation Post-Secondary Value Commission. But throughout all of these platforms, the one thing that I have learned is that your truth is the most valuable tool that any of us have. And it should be celebrated, because our truths have the power to transcend any academic field, any geography, race, religion, or socioeconomic background. Our truths have the power to transcend any individual that stands in our way and tells us to wait our turn before we start solving the problems that are plaguing our daily lives, communities, and planet. Standing here before you today, I'm reminded of a student named Emma that I met in Fletcher Accounting. We're seeing that through all of these movements, especially those here held in DC, that so many students are being denied their truths. After our candid conversation, Emma asked me, "Are you actually going to do anything about this? Or are you just like everyone else that walks in, asks a couple of questions, pretends they care, and forgets about us the next day?" For far too long, students like Emma have been denied their truths, successfully blocked by policy and jargon and systematic barriers that disenfranchise those on the forefront of the world's most epic issues. But that time for silence and complacency, it's up. And we're seeing it through movements led nationally by our youth. And it's quite fitting that I'm speaking to you in DC, our nation's capital, as it's a reminder for all of you to capitalize on the youth when solving the world's most wicked challenges. Young people are the Earth's most untapped resource for hope. Now, this fight does not stop at the conference's end or when we go back to our classrooms or offices or even the wildest corners that Earth has to offer. I stand here before you today, National Geographic explorers, researchers, scientists, educators, citizens, that there is so much more left to do. More left to do for Charlotte and Brianna and Brian and Susie. More to do for parents like mine that traveled unimaginable distances for opportunity. More to do for our oceans and waterways that we still continue to pollute with chemicals and plastics. More to do to ensure a bright, successful, and sustainable future for every single young and not so young person across the globe. Now, of course, in all of this, there's a role for you. And I implore each and every one of you to go back to your communities and incorporate young people in all that you do. Reach out to those that are quietest. They usually have the most to say. Invest early and deeply in the underdogs, especially those whose chances of success seem most bleak. And above all, just listen. By listening to the stories of those that have come before us, I hope that you come to understand, as I have, the profound and undeniable power that young people can bring to the table to make our world permanently better. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Felix. I'm one of about 75,000 children and youth planting trees all around the world to tackle the climate crisis. When I was 9 years old in 4th grade, my teacher asked me to give a little presentation in my class about the climate crisis. And when I prepared that presentation, I heard about Wangari Maathai, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate who had started a movement to plant 30 million trees with lots of other women across Kenya and East Africa. So we thought we should plant some trees as well, and we set ourselves a target, 1 million trees in each country of the world. but I don't think any of us knew what 1 million was or even how many countries existed. But a few weeks later, we planted our first tree, and we were incredibly lucky because 2 local journalists showed up and reported about that tree. And that's why some other local schools planted some trees as well. And we found a slightly older student who created a very simple website for us. And that website was essentially just a ranking among local schools of who had planted the most trees. So lots of schools wanted to outcompete their neighboring schools, wanted to be at the top of our leaderboard, and this is how Plant for the Planet spread. After 1 year, we had planted about 50,000 trees. After 3 years, 1 million, and children and youth all across the world started joining us and started planting trees with us. And all these children and youth started to do a lot more than just plant trees. They started giving presentations in their classes, but then also in front of Rotary clubs. They started talking to their mayors and other government officials. Many spoke in front of their national parliaments or had sit-downs with their presidents. And on 3 occasions, our members have even spoken in front of the UN General Assembly. And I want to just tell you one example. This is Jana. She's 12 years old. And a few months ago, she gave a talk at a conference just after the CEO of Deutsche Bank and her governor. And people were so impressed that journalists only reported about her. And a few weeks later, she got an invitation from her governor for a sit-down meeting. So she went there and explained to him for half an hour that he needs to make his state the first carbon neutral state. And actually, I just heard a few days ago, she got an invitation to meet him again. So I'm very excited about how that will turn out. And none of this is an accident because we organize Plant for the Planet academies all around the world to empower our young members to do exactly that. So at these academies, we bring together lots of kids and they learn about climate change, why it's so important to plant trees, and most importantly, they make plans of what they want to do next. And so far, we've organized about 1,200 such academies in 71 countries. And maybe this is why, after Wangari Maathai passed away in 2011, the UN Environment Program asked us to lead the Billion Tree campaign, the campaign she had initially started. That campaign had the incredible goal of planting 1 billion trees, but became so successful that by now 13.6 billion trees have been planted globally, thanks to governments, organizations, and companies all across the world contributing. And this is why, a few years ago, we started asking ourselves, where do we go from here? What's the next step? And because of that, we had 2 big questions. I think very obvious questions. The first one was, how many trees even exist globally? And the second question was, how many additional trees could we plant? And we obviously thought that those were very simple questions, so we asked a couple of ecologists and a couple of climate scientists, but soon noticed that nobody had any real answers for us. Until we found 3 phenomenal scientists at Yale University who did a 3-year research project for us and came back to us with 2 important answers. The first one is that about 3 trillion trees exist globally. And to give you a bit of context, we used to have about double as many trees, but in human history, we reduced them to 3 trillion. And the second, more important answer was they did a study to figure out how many additional trees we could plant without competing with agriculture and other land uses. And they concluded that we could increase our global forest cover by up to 30% to 4 trillion trees. And if we managed to plant these trees, they would capture about 1/3 of all human-made carbon emissions. So obviously, they wouldn't solve the climate crisis, but they would be a sort of time joker, allowing us to actually keep our Paris commitments and ensure that climate change, temperature rise, does not rise beyond 2 degrees. And what I think is most amazing, most fabulous about all of this is that by far the most potential for new forests exists in Africa and Latin America. So by planting trees there, we can also tackle global inequality by creating hundreds of millions of jobs and an incredible amount of wealth through these wonderful resources. And through those years in our work, we also noticed that it's not just about the number of trees we plant, but also about how we plant them. And that became incredibly clear to me when we had a little project with a local government in southern Mexico. And during that project, we found out that the average survival rate of local tree planting projects was just 22%. So they planted lots and lots of trees, but if you came back to a year later, only 22% survived. So we wanted to show that it's possible to restore forests more efficiently and more effectively. And this is why we took over the responsibility of 22,000 hectares of degraded forest, degraded rainforest. And we started restoring that area. Today, we have over 100 employees there and plant on average 1 tree every 15 seconds. And we've now achieved a survival rate of not 22, but 94%. And it only costs us an average €1 per planted tree. So how do we fund all of this? Obviously, we've got private donors, we've got some companies helping us. But the main way we fund our trees is actually chocolate. And this started about 8 years ago when we wanted to do a project with the German chocolate industry. But not a single company wanted to support us. And this is when one of our members, Max, I think he was like 11 at the time, said, let's make our own chocolate. And of course, we all laughed at first. But this turned into the Change chocolate, which is, of course, fair trade and carbon neutral. And with every 5 bars of the chocolate, we can plant a tree, because the entire profit from the chocolate goes directly into tree planting. And it has now actually become the most sold fair trade chocolate in Germany. And currently, we're also working on an app for the chocolate. So if you're out in the city, near a store that sells the chocolate, you'll hear a beep in your pocket and know where to go shopping. And a few years ago, we asked the astronauts on the International Space Station if they wanted to try as well. And a few months later, 12 bars of the chocolate were on board the Albert Einstein. So 2 bars of chocolate for every astronaut. And since then, we call our chocolate astronaut food. And in all of these years, we keep trying to figure out new ways to communicate our message. And one of the most effective ways we've discovered so far was our campaign, Stop Talking, Start Planting, where we cover the mouths of famous people to show that something has to happen. For instance, we took one such picture with the King of Spain. And the day after we took the picture, it was in all newspapers. And not just in the newspapers, but on the cover pages. Here it's on the side, but we count that as well. And over those years, many of our members of Plan for the Planet have been protesting around the world. And in 2015, I remember a couple of our members said that we should do a climate strike. We should not go to school and strike instead, to show how serious we are about this. And so we tried it, and we got like a couple of 100 kids in like 5 countries to participate. And we tried it again the next year, but it just didn't really work, so we kind of gave up on it. And then a few years later, this girl, Greta Thunberg, comes and has a similar idea, but does it much, much better. And obviously, lots of our members have been joining her since then, and what she has achieved is absolutely phenomenal. And I mention this because she has become my second big hero next to Wangari Maathai. And I think actually, her work hasn't made as big of a splash here in the US because your news cycle is a bit more distracted than in some other countries. But it's made a huge difference in Germany. Her work has been dominating our headlines since the beginning of this year. And polls have shown that at the beginning of this year, 9% of Germans believed that climate change was our biggest issue. And just a month ago, 24% of Germans said climate change was our biggest issue. And that was all thanks to her and all her supporters. So one last thing I want to tell you. we noticed, right, we're planting a lot of trees, but even if we continue scaling up, we might be able to plant 100 million by 2030, but nowhere close to the 1 trillion we need to get planted. So we want to make it as easy as possible for anyone around the world to join in and help us. And because of that, for the last 2 years, we've been building an app that we're going to launch officially this September. And the app is very simple. You sign up and you have your own personal tree counter. And if you then go outside and plant a tree, you can register that tree and say what kind of tree you planted, when you planted it, where exactly you planted it, and so on. And if you're very enthusiastic, you can also add measurements of the trees as it grows. But there's obviously a lot of people that might be too lazy to plant trees themselves or just can't plant trees themselves. So what these people can do is they can go in this app and discover tree planting projects all around the world. And for every tree planting project, you discover what the average price per tree is, what the survival rate is, what kinds of trees they plant, and you can see satellite images of these projects and also how these projects have been developing over time. And then you can select your favorite project and donate directly through the app. And what's also really important is that we won't take any of the money, but 100% of the money goes directly to the tree planting project. And there's obviously a few other tools to make sure that this is fun to use, like competitions and a new type of Forbes list that ranks people not by how much money they have, but by how many trees they've planted. So if you want to try and see what this app looks like, the beta version is already available in the App Store and the Android Play Store. Trees are very simply the only machines we have that can capture CO2. And this is why our message is stop talking, start planting. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Melati, and I'm an 18-year-old full-time change maker. I'm very honored to stand here today and have gone after two incredible people that I really look up to and be a part of the event today. I can't wait to share my story with you, but in order to do that, I'm going to bring up a picture of a boat where my parents met and that I was lucky enough to call my second home. I grew up in Indonesia, and this is actually where my sister and I had our childhood games. We played all the time on this boat, and we would grow up sailing across the 17,000 islands of Indonesia. And you can imagine what this does to for a childhood. You know, we would wake up and look out the window and see a completely different scenario. That we'd wake up in a completely different area. I remember we'd go to sometimes so remote places that, you know, when we would flush the toilet on the boat, the phosphorus would glow, and my sister and I would just keep flushing and just see all of these, like it was a glowing toilet. Or, you know, we would wash up and there was a pink sand beach, or we would go to the most local tribes that we would see, and we would sit and listen to their cultures, sit and listen to languages we did not understand, but managed to connect with these people all across our beautiful country. And so, you know, we would go to the most wildest places where we would see a lot of different funky, cool animals that, you know, we would sometimes like to play with. And my sister, that's Isabel, she has a very, very different personality than me. She's usually next to me on stage, but she's currently finishing her 11th grade. So she says hi from the classroom all the way in Bali. But, you know, we started to recognize the problem when we grew up, where we're now in Bali in Indonesia. And no matter how far we would go, no matter to all the wild places we would discover and explore, the further away we got from civilization, it didn't matter. There was always plastic. It was everywhere. Whether we would go swimming in the ocean, we'd find plastic. Whether we'd go into the rice fields, there was plastic. In the mountains, there was plastics on the streets and the roads and the gutters. There was plastic everywhere. All right, so there was this awakening of plastic pollution that we just couldn't shake off. But at the same time, it was time to go to school.
This is actually a photo. It's not the best resolution. I apologize. But it was also taken on an iPhone 4, so we got to appreciate that. But this is way back, and that blue little dot right there is actually my hair tie back in 3rd grade. And we were learning, and take a minute to just remember the time that you first heard the names and the stories of people like Nelson Mandela, Lady Diana, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King. I remember the very day my sister and I learned about these real world leaders, these change makers that made a difference in their communities throughout history. And we went home that day and we looked at each other and said, well, what can we do as kids living on the island of Bali? What can we do right now? You see, we didn't want to wait until we were older to start making a difference. We didn't want to get our high school diploma, go to college, and then start making a difference. We looked at ourselves and said, we want to do something right now. So, next thing you know, here we are, ready to take action. Next to this inspiration of this class, right, connecting it back to the awakening of plastic pollution. We went home and we put papers out on the floor and we started brainstorming. What were some of the problems our island home Bali was facing? And again, that connection we felt to the environment, having grown up on that boat, going through Indonesia, connecting with nature at such an intense level, we thought we had to do something about the plastic pollution. And at the time, we learned that 40 countries around the whole world had already said no to plastic bags. So you can imagine, at 10 and 12, we thought, 40 other countries? Whoa. Come on, Bali, come on, Indonesia. We can also do it. And so without a business plan, a strategy, a timeline, or a budget, we created Bye Bye Plastic Bags. And the rest is history. We started 6 years ago now, campaigning. At the age of 10 and 12, we started Bye Bye Plastic Bags. I'm 18 years old now. And Bye Bye Plastic Bags has become one of the largest NGOs driven by young people in Indonesia. We've accomplished and created lesson plans that we go into schools, host workshops, spoken to over 50,000 people. And one of the most proudest achievements is, as of this year, Bali is implementing a ban on single-use plastic bags. Thank you. But there are many lessons that we've learned over the course of these 6 years, and some that I think cross over a lot of the work that you do as well. Lesson number 1, team. We learned this very early on. You cannot do anything by yourself. You always need to pull that team together. And for us, it was at first our closest friends, and we would host team meetings at snack time, lunchtime, at any chance we got after school. But lesson 2 came quickly after. Think outside the box. And I think this is something that comes naturally actually to our generation. If you didn't realize from the 2 previous speakers before me, we're constantly put in a position where we have to think how we can creatively overcome obstacles. And the story that I attached to this lesson is actually Bali's biggest cleanup. So when building a movement, right, we depend on the hope of people, their engagement, how we can get them to feel personally involved in the movement. So we're 5 years running, 4 years running, when we thought, okay, we're starting to lose people. They don't believe in it anymore. They're thinking, really? Is Bali really going to ban plastic bags? And they stopped showing up. So we were having a team dinner one night, and this question came up of how can we keep people involved? And one team member actually raised his hand very quietly and said, hey, why don't we do Bali's biggest cleanup? The entire coastline in one day. And slowly, we started nodding our heads. And we said, yeah, that makes sense, why not? And so in a very short time frame, together with a collaboration across many different sectors on the island, we were able to pull off the first Bali's biggest cleanup. And over the course of 3 days in 3 years, 1 day each year, we managed to mobilize 45,000 people in 350 locations, not just the coastline, but the rivers, the schools, the streets, the rice fields, mountains. And we prevented 130 tons of plastic from entering the oceans. Now, lesson number 3. Those of you that are parents, I know my parents will definitely tell you that this is probably the hardest lesson to learn. Persistence and commitment is key. Walking your talk, not giving up when it gets difficult. And sometimes that means doing things that you don't always want to do. Instead of going to the movies, you're out there on the beach cleaning up, getting signatures at a petition instead of going to the mall or whatever teenagers do. But, this was, I think, one of the lessons that I'm still learning to this day, how to really embody this and stick to it. But I've learned over the course of these years is that this lesson actually brings the most incredible achievements. My personal favorite is actually seeing bioplastic bags spread across the world, where young people, when they're watching our TED Talk in the classroom or seeing our viral videos on social media, they are the ones that are reaching out, sending emails, sliding into those DMs, and saying, hey, I want to do the same back where I come from. And so that's where you can see bioplastic bags now implemented in over 40 countries around the world, where we have kick-ass young leaders who are in middle school, high school, and university that are now standing up in their communities saying that they want to ban plastic bags. But it's not just plastic bags, and it's not just the environment. There are so many issues that we're facing in our time, in our childhood. Whether it being the injustices happening to our education system, the broken education system, or the social injustices, gender equality, climate change. There are so many interconnected, urgent, and relevant issues that we're facing in the world today. But the good news is that young people are rising all around the world in every single corner. And this is where the momentum is building. This is where we're seeing a trend, but also a lifestyle where we're recognizing that the time we're living in, we have the technology, we have the innovation, we have the young, bright people that want to get up. I've spoken to many young people around the world. That's my main audience. And it's brought me to many different classrooms around the world. One thing that I really feel that we're missing is that we're seeing that young people are hungry for the knowledge, for the right skills, for the right tools, for the experience to get connected, right? And we heard that earlier at the introduction of the session. Connection is what we're losing. We don't have. Classrooms are currently not teaching. How are we supposed to get kids who never see or engage with the environment to care about the environment? How do we get kids to feel motivated and a part of this global situation that we're a part of? And that's one of the unique parts of when our team goes on, or when Felix steps on, or when Sahar steps into a classroom. We're bringing this relatable factor where kids are seeing something that is possible. They are able to relate, and something inside them clicks. And I see them sit a little straighter, take a deep breath, and say, wait, how old are you? Wait, I'm 18 too. Wait, do you still go to school? Yeah, I graduated, but I went to school and I had homework and I had to study, but it's possible. So naturally, and here's our next project, we decided that we had to create a youth-topia, right? Where we provide those real-world examples of young people who are on the front lines, getting all of those world-class people like Felix, like Sahar, like Greta Thunberg, like Shitezkat, like AOC. All of the young people who are on the front lines, breaking boundaries, challenging the status quo, and getting these real-life people to teach other young people around the world. We need to be able to scale up that attitude and teach the how, so that everyone can be a change maker. I really, really believe that us kids may only be 25% of the world's population, but we are 100% of the future. Thank you.
I want to just bring them back for one more round of thank yous, don't you think? One thing that happens when youth come together like this is they sort of bond for life. So you can tell these three have pretty much bonded. Thank you guys so much. We couldn't be more honored to have you here today. Okay, we are wrapping up the day, but isn't the symposium off to a spectacular start? You know, this is my first Explorers Festival here at Base Camp, and I have to say I'm blown away. And today I learned so much, but I was also reminded of some really important things. One is, you know that phrase about beauty being in the eye of the beholder? But I also learned that someone can certainly pass their passion for a particular species or a particular issue on to you and make you just as determined to understand, to connect, and to protect. Also learned that odd couples make powerful allies in the field, like technology and art. That we should all get out of our comfort zone, and that sometimes you just have to let yourself fly. And how cool was that rhino hologram? All right. I want to extend a heartfelt thanks to all of our presenters. You know, they're working to confront some of the most difficult challenges and complexities on our planet. And given the scope and scale of some of the challenges that we hear, it can be tempted to give in to that sense of hopelessness, to believe that problems facing our planet are too big or too overwhelming to counter. But today's symposium shows us in spades that we are making progress and that we have so many reasons to be hopeful. You know, when we celebrate what's right, as this quote says, it's coming on the screen, we find the energy to fix what's wrong. Throughout this week, we're celebrating what's right. And today we saw the profound power of young leaders to catalyze action and positive change. We saw the power of innovative technologies to drive humanity forward. And we saw the power of storytelling to bring the plight of exploited wildlife into public consciousness and encourage their protection. We, all of us, are a global community of change makers. And what we've seen on this stage today, this afternoon, is just a sampling of the people, tools, and stories that have the power to energize and motivate, cultivate understanding, touch hearts, and ignite change. We have several more days of great people and programming ahead. Please join us for the reception in the courtyard, thanks to our National Geographic partners. It's at their courtesy. And take the opportunity to connect, to continue the conversation, and as you saw what these young people did with each other, make a new friend. Thank you. We'll see you tomorrow.